presenter today is Patrick Bixler, and Dr. Bixler is a research assistant professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. His research focuses on collaborative governance, performance, and evaluation. And Patrick is going to talk to us today about social network analysis that he's completed in the Northwest Boreal region. And so, Patrick, we are passing the presenting over to you.
Hey, thanks, Anne, and thanks, everyone. Just a real quick check. Are you seeing my intro slide here?
You can ignore this.
We can see it.
Excellent. Cool. Yeah, so great, thanks. So my name's Patrick Bixler. I'm at University of Texas. Working with the Northwest Boreal for about 3 years, and we'll be presenting today on some network analysis that we've been doing over the last couple of years, a couple iterations of it. I'll be kind of presenting this work from a few different perspectives, just to kind of lay that groundwork right here. Just a few slides on the background about why we're thinking about networks and how it applies in the broader context. Some slides on describing the network. So this was kind of the step one we did with the NWB LCC, describing the network in kind of network analysis terms. We have sampled 2 different time periods, so we'll talk a little bit about looking at network change over time. We'll think about how we sort of shape up networks and network characteristics with respect to specific goals. Network's not really just a network, but it takes a certain structure and a function depending on the goals that I'm working towards. So we'll add a little bit and get into some more regression type analysis that I've been doing, thinking about how network positions influence the robustness of governance systems and influence kind of a network towards specific goals. About 4 different kind of sections that will shift gears a little bit at section. So real quick, some background for this work. We're in the Anthropocene, and what do I mean by that? We live in this context where there's environmental change occurring at multiple scales. That's really that's the constant. It's not. We sort of have to understand how to respond and manage within that context on a day-to-day basis. Our actions have nonlinear feedbacks, which we need to understand and respond to. Command and control approaches, environmental management, probably no longer sufficient. So what we thought about government managing a particular unit 15, 20, 30 years ago, now we're shifting to think more about governance and how that can be adaptive to environmental change. So cultivating adaptive capacity is a key aspect of how we need to be thinking about governance. So how do we think about adaptive capacity? Well, one framework that I employ, and when we think about network analysis, it definitely draws on thinking about social capital. This quote in a textbook that I used to teach a class, and the quote says, "Cash-strapped wildlife management agencies can reduce administrative overhead by paying for management with social capital." That's like a very literal use of the application of social capital, but it's compelling to think that in a resource-constrained environment that we can achieve management objectives by using social capital. What we mean by social capital is the value of your relationships in a real simple term. It includes kind of networks and norms, values, reciprocity, the diversity of the network, participation in networks. So whether that's you at an individual level and the value of your personal relationships, or from the approach of this research, thinking about the value of the relationships that your organization or your agency has. Theorize that networks can have an environmental outcome that we care about. We see a lot in the literature when we think about governance and management. Networks are sort of a buzz, and they have been for a few years now. And network analysis, the methodological approach, provides insights into the patterns and the structure of social capital. And so that's kind of the intersection of what we're talking about today. This final point here, that landscapes are a context for collaboration. So when we think about network analysis, one of the big challenges is bounding the network. How do we know where the boundaries around the network are? In the case of the Northwest Boreal LCC, we probably have looked at the steering committee and bounded the network that way within the landscape of the Northwest Boreal. So think about landscape conservation. We think about people working together across large geographies, of political or administrative boundaries, to conserve both ecological and social cultural aspects, and thinking about the future, for a sustainable future for both people and nature. Increasingly, policy is articulating this approach. So we see landscape conservation cooperatives, the Forbes Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, the BARC restoration efforts take this large landscape approach. There's at least over 140 different large landscape initiatives that are NGO-driven that we've identified in North America. So a little bit of background to my work in this landscape and with this group of folks. In 2015, Amanda came to a presentation I gave kind of doing similar work in the Crown of the Continent. He approached me afterwards. By fall of 2015, we were doing our first round of some network analysis data. So we designed an online survey, some data. Spring of 2016, there was a webinar, and also attended the first steering committee, and first steering committee in person around then. August 2016, this is an important concurrent project, slightly separate deliverable from the network analysis piece, but we're doing this work concurrently where we've engaged the steering committee in an open standards process. Some of you are probably familiar with that, but essentially we've mapped out an impact change. So thinking through what's our ultimate conservation outcome that we want to see as a landscape conservation cooperative. Let's work back to intermediate outcomes and actions that will lead us to that goal. So we've been thinking about collectively, or the steering committee has been thinking collectively about what are the goals, and each individual organization contribute and work towards those goals. In January, so a little over a year ago, we collected the second round of social network analysis data. So we kind of have a time 1 data and a time 2 data now. And it brings us to today. In the next few months, we'll be summarizing both the outcomes of the goal setting process as well as the network analysis. If anyone's interested, there's a report on this first round of network analysis data that was submitted. I believe it's on the NWB LCC website. And so what we'll be doing now with this new round of data is kind of adding an extra chapter to it. So real quickly, social network analysis is a methodological tool. Social networks can be analyzed through statistics and represented in a graphical form. The graphs are made up of individual nodes. So in case when you see a node, we're looking at an organization that's part of the steering committee of the NWB LCC. And then those nodes or those organizations are connected by ties, edges, links. I may use any of those terms in this presentation, but they're actually the relationship between two organizations. And when we look at a map, what can we visualize? We visualize the composition of the network. We can quantify a number of nodes. So essentially, we can just kind of count the number of nodes. We can count the number of edges or links between nodes. And we can think about how different statistics fit together to give us a metric or an indicator of network cohesiveness. And back towards social capital, I'll get into network cohesiveness a little bit more here in a minute, but there's multiple kinds of social capital, and particularly network cohesiveness is referring to what we would think of as bonding social capital. Bonding social capital is also what's attributed to effective collective action. So when we think about building trust, building relationships, becoming more cohesive together, that's effective for large-scale collective action. Visualize the strength ties and where kind of those ties are made up of. When we think about just describing the network, this was research, or this was part of the first round of the collection, and so you may have seen some of these graphs before, but here's the steering committee, the Northwest Boreal steering committee from the fall 2015 data. You can see the different kinds of connections and why these different organizations and agencies are connected. For the most part, people would report that there are multiple reasons that they're connected. It's not just one reason. It's not just to share data. It's not just because of planning. There are multiple reasons. We actually saw in this more recent round of data collection that multiple category increased significantly. So 2015, about 50% of the ties were reported to being for multiple reasons. The number this most recent round was closer to 80%. You can also see the distribution of universities, tribes, NGOs, and other partnerships, agencies, and state and provincial agencies, and kind of breaks down. This goes into a little bit more depth of the type of information that's being exchanged. So if we don't make mutually exclusive multiple categories, we can see by and large most people reporting data. That's kind of the substance or the main reason that organizations are connected, followed by subject expertise, followed by planning, followed by management practices, implementation, recording, regulatory reasons, and then an other category. Look at how the different organizations, how central different steering committee members of the different organizations, agencies are to the network. And so what this figure does is take, it's essentially a matrix or a matrix that's on three different axes, with the size of the organization or the circle representing that third axis. So the circles that are larger, that are farther towards the top and farther towards the right, are going to be the more central organizations across the three metrics of total degree, in degree, and between this centrality. Visualize what that looks like compared to the most central organization, steering committee. And I'm showing this now, and then we'll get a little bit more in depth here in a minute on what some of this means. Let's look at the strength of ties. When we think about network literature, there's some compelling theories on the strength of weak ties, and so maybe it's not always bonding and strong ties that are important, but that we get really useful information from our weak ties. So the strength of tie, and thinking about the strength of ties is important. And we met in these surveys by the frequency of interaction. About 61% of the ties that were reported were just on an annual basis. So yes, I work with an organization or this agency, but really we're only looking or exchanging information about once a year. 20% of those ties were reported to be quarterly, 12% monthly, 6% weekly. I look at the distribution of the degree, and really what you see is a pretty steady decreasing distribution here, which is good. I mean, it's showing this is a kind of a descriptive perspective of the robustness of the network. There's not 3 or 4 organizations that have all the ties, but it's sort of a generally declining slope there of organs and the number of ties or connections they have. Again, I'll come back to this here in a minute. So in 2015, we looked at this information. Seeing there is a map of not just the steering committee members, but the committee members plus the additional organizations that we work with. And we also did in this map was break down, for example, the BLM may have 6 or 7 or 12 different units, both geographical but also substantive units that are a part of this network. So this map shows the different units as well as all the additional partners that steering committee members work with across the Boreal landscape. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the first section. It's just really about describing the network, kind of showing the network analysis as a tool to visualize and describe the network. What can we say about assessing change over time? Thinking again, I'm going to use this bonding social capital. It's a particular kind of social capital, and it's going to refer to network cohesiveness. Network cohesiveness can be essentially summarized by 3 different network statistics, the first being density, the first being clustering coefficient, and the last being mutual or reciprocal ties. So I'll start with the last. The reciprocal ties, I have a tie to you, you have a tie to me. It's going both ways. It's being reported as being a tie that's both ways. Clustering coefficient, the more close the statistic is to 1, the more it is sort of one cohesive unit or subgroup. And density, so closer to the statistic is to 1 of a density, or, well, a statistic of 1 means that all possible ties exist. And so we start to compare and think about how, essentially becoming more cohesive over time. And so this was the sample, again, there was about a 1.5 years between these 2 samples. We can just get the descriptive aspects of number of organizations. In really 2017, that should be 33, so it's a typo. But so there was 1 additional organization that was officially part of the steering committee in 2017. The number of ties between the first round we sampled and the second round we sampled decreased a little bit, as did the average number of ties. I'll use consistent kind of, are these numbers increasing versus are these numbers decreasing the rest of the presentation, so this kind of color-coded table. Think about statistics of network cohesiveness. The prosody, so the number of mutual ties increased, percentage of mutual ties increased. The density was statistically the same as was the clustering coefficient. So there's no distinct change in density or clustering coefficient, but a significant change in the reciprocity. I think there was probably some subtle increases in overall network cohesiveness that we saw between 2016 and 2017 based on this data. I can also ask, there's a sort of wonder or there's a question, what is the probability that these relationships or these ties are happening for a particular reason, or would they have occurred randomly, right? So what is really the effect, or can we statistically, or in terms of probability, say that there's an effect that us actively engaged in this process of convening a Northwest Boreal steering committee has an effect on this network structure. So we can use exponential random graph modeling to test the probability that these ties are not by chance. And so we see a positive effect in both 2016 and 2017, essentially saying that the probability is extremely low that network configuration in these relationships are occurring by chance. We also see within simulations models of the network, which is good. So shifting gears a little bit, it's one thing to think about a network and network governance, right? Do we have a solid network governance? Is our core or sort of, I guess, the steering committee network, is it becoming more cohesive? So is that a good thing? I think would say it's a good thing, but you sort of have to ask, for what purpose? It's one thing to have a network. It's another thing to have a network working towards specific goals. So one thing that we did that is really interesting is think about the different goals that the steering committee network are working towards or should be working towards in theory based on strategic plan. There were 5 key goals that were outlined in the strategic plan. The first is determine the baseline data sets needed to reach conservation goals. Second, identify trajectories of change. Third, identify, develop, and support shared landscape conservation goals. Number 4, improve information sharing. And number 5, build strategic networks. I tend to believe that these different goals or these different functions would have different structures and thereby also have different statistics. We want, let's see, example, identify, develop, and support shared landscape conservation goals. That is something that's going to require a large degree of network cohesiveness. We're going to agree upon identify, develop, and support shared goals. It's going to require this bonding social capital. It's going to require this collective action, and therefore we would expect it to have higher levels of network cohesiveness compared to identified trajectories of change, which is a very sort of scientific endeavor. We can do that decentralized. Ultimately, we're integrating information. It's not going to require us all being on the same page because there's going to be different aspects of the research that are happening at once in order to identify trajectories of change. And so kind of a rough approximation of how we would think about these different objectives and whether we expect a high degree of network cohesiveness, sort of neutral, or a low degree of network cohesiveness. For example, coordinating and supporting conservation delivery that doesn't occur at the scale of 230 million acres, occurs in particular parcels. And so while it's important to be coordinated, it's also actions that are happening on the ground in different locations. And so a degree of network cohesiveness may not be necessary for conservation delivery. Just at a course level, what we see when we break down by categories is in a lot of ways what we would expect, which is good. Improving information sharing. This is the first year of data, just the side note, but improving information sharing is the most active sort of goal. The most people report working with other organizations on information sharing. It has one of the highest densities. So, right, we're gonna share information. It's important that we're communicating and we're all sort of on the same page. Again, determining baseline data sets, another one that has a high density relative to the others. We would expect that. And the example, coordinate and support conservation delivery, relatively low density compared to the others. What I'm going to do is kind of walk through a series of slides here and not spend too much time on any individual slide, but they're going to contain 3 different bits of information. They're going to include the network maps from 16 and 17, so you can see just the change in that structure over time. To include these centrality distribution maps, and so essentially what these are, a standardized score for each individual node within the steering committee. So how central is each node across these 3 different metrics towards the achievement of that specific goal? Does that change over time? I'm also going to include this table, just looking these metrics getting sort of increasing or decreasing in terms of network cohesiveness. The determined baseline data sets, we have a set of information right there. Interestingly, that reciprocity significantly increased for baseline data sets, so more people are reporting that they're working together. High trajectories of change. Density score on this particular goal. Identify, develop, and support landscape goals. This is where another low density score here, and it's where one in particular really jumps out at me just with what I would expect or hypothesize in terms of how this this should be working together and what I'm seeing in the statistics. Information sharing across the region. Facilitate and support landscape planning. Another work that's has very low density. Build works across the region. And that's the last goal. One thing I will point out, if you look at these, the node centrality statistics on the right, you do typically see there are 2 or 3 consistently central in these networks. I know 2 of them off the top of my head that are always really consistent are the BLM and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So perhaps not surprising information that we're finding there. So how can we use this information, and particularly the data that we're pulling about the centrality of these individual organizations to think about robustness of governance? So do we have a robust governance network when we think about the steering committee and the Northwest Boreal LCC? So 2 ways to think about network robustness. The first one is our network resilient to the removal of individual components or constituent parts? And are we seeing an alignment towards goals over time? When we think about the removal of constituent parts, we can do modeling and end up with something kind of like this. So essentially, if 10% of the nodes were lost, we would lose 20% of the social connectivity of the network. If 20% of the nodes were lost, we would lose 40% of the social connectivity of the network. 40% of the nodes lost, about 50%, 60% of the nodes lost. The connectivity of the entire network would be gone. And you also see, we need to think about this in terms of how do we remove nodes? Do we remove the middle nodes first? Do we do it randomly? Really, you're not seeing much of a difference. So there are those 2 or 3 central nodes that are really, really important and have a lot of connections. But connections, it may take longer to get from point A to point C if you remove B, but you can still get from point A to point C in this network. And that's kind of what this graph's telling me, that even remove some of these very central nodes, the connectivity in general is still the same. So more about the number of nodes that potentially may be lost than specific nodes. And so I'm going to weave back in this goal-setting information in project we worked on, because part of what we've been trying to think through is how can we use this network analysis information in terms of organization agency centrality and network cohesiveness to think about being more effective together and achieving some of these goals. So essentially where we ended up with the open standards process and setting these landscape conservation goals, there were 3 primary sort of outcomes that these goals led to. The first was around improving information sharing. The second was about implementing management to build landscape resilience. And the third was work better together, so better collaboration. What we can do is think about how these different network positions may influence the achievement of these different goals. Or to put slightly differently, depending on your position in the network, are you more or less likely to be supporting communication, to be supporting management, or to be supporting collaboration? And run a logit regression model that has the outcome variable, the probability of these different organizations, whether that be management, communication, or collaboration. And we can see the effect of the different position in the network towards the different goals. Does this mean? Kind of translate that to read for each just reporting the statistically significant findings here, but for additional out degree that an organization has, they're 10% more likely to prioritize communication. So the more that I report having, the more likely I to prioritize communication as the overall goal. Traditional out degree, an organization is 10% less likely to prioritize collaboration. So again, the more organizations I report working with, more likely to prioritize communication, less likely to prioritize collaboration. And for each additional closeness score, so how central am I to all the other nodes in the network, organization is 3 times more likely to prioritize collaboration. I will say this is a relatively preliminary analysis, but also really exciting the way that we can think about the influence that these different network positions have towards the achievement of certain or specific network goals. And so what does this all mean? Goals of a network are important. So a network is not just a network. A network is oriented to specific goals. So being really explicit what those goals are does have an impact on the structure and function of that network. And so I think that's always really important to keep in mind, that those goals, that networks are goal-oriented, and for them to be effective, to be efficient, we need to be really clear about what those goals are and think about how we structure relationships, communication, collaboration, management around those specific goals. That network positions do matter, and they may matter in different ways depending on the goal. The kind of the conclusion that comes out of that regression analysis that we think about or be able to prescribe some collaboration, some suggestions or mandates around how we think about connecting with other organizations. We want to cultivate reciprocal relationships between 2 organizations. Don't want an organization to really be the hub and have a lot of outgoing relationships because they are focused on communication, and so that's going to be a good role for them or not. So that way central in the network is going to really matter depending on the goal that you're trying to serve. I think this work has also been able to demonstrate metrics to measure bonding social capital. I think it's really cool, sort of the way we're demonstrating the effect of the measurement of bonding social capital over time. In this particular case, it raises some interesting questions. Do we expect it to increase every year? I'm sure that we do. But also how to account for leadership and external institutional changes. There were some significant external factors that were going on as I was conducting the second survey. And so how do you think about the influence of those external factors on people respond to network analysis or surveys around relationships? And it leads to this third point about data acquisition. Primary data collection's always tough. Surveys are always onerous on the participants. So to streamline relationship data collection. I'm not sure that I have the answer to that yet, but it's something I'm always thinking about. We did have, it was an interesting, the response rate, both years were over 90%. We had different organizations not responding. So the first year there were a few organizations that didn't respond. In the second year it was a different few organizations that didn't respond. There's going to be a little bit of that non-response bias in the network analysis results. I think network analysis is really, ultimately the question of the motivation for this work, at least particularly early on, was can we create some metrics around collaboration? Are we getting better? Is there something here or a tool here that we can use to report on how effective we're being collaborating? And so I think the short answer is yes. Like, we can quantify, we can statistically measure this, but that it probably needs to be accompanied by some other quantitative or qualitative scorecard type measures. That using a network analysis of number itself probably is not or effective to paint the whole picture. Network analysis is really fun. I enjoy it. It's particularly in this experience with the Northwest Boreal. It's been a really great tool to ask questions and reflect on the structure and the nature of the network and of collaboration. Still haven't quite figured out how to spit out an answer, and that answer be able to suggest or guide future collaboration or network building efforts. But it's a really great tool to pull people together and ask questions around how we're working together. And that's similar to being clear about how this tool can be useful. I think this work is incredibly interesting, but trying to keep a focus on how it can be useful and making, right? What are we all working together for? And making conservation outcomes more effective on the ground. And I think trying to dive this research and understanding towards that. And that's one more slide here that I've always been thinking about this figure again recently, and I'm not entirely sure how to tie into the conclusion, but I think it's really important to always keep in mind the life of network governance, and the Northwest Boreal is a really great example, given the recent kind of shift in change in transformation that it's undergone. But all networks, collaborations will kind of go through this cycle of activation, collectivity, institutionalization, and either stabilization, decline, or reorientation. And always that last is really important. Just think about that. If and when networks dissipate, they become reoriented, that social capital, those relationships are still maintained. They're just kind of reorganized in different spaces. And really kind of thinking about an adaptive cycle out of resilience and how to think about that in terms of governance. And so I crossed this figure from some previous research recently, and it just got me thinking about network governance life cycles, and it's relevant for this research, definitely. So that's all I have. I'd love to open it up for some questions, discussion. Thanks for the time.
Patrick, questions for Patrick?
This is Brett. I've got two questions for you. One of them is quicker. Way at the beginning, you were showing the different things the different nodes the participants wanted from the workshops, and you were talking about the sharing of different stuff. And I was wondering if you delineated between the sharing, which is like official, like where people get together at meetings and discuss how to sharing information, or if it also included sort of things that have happened in a more informal sense. So people made the connections, they made the relationships, and the network has sort of taken on a life of its own outside of the formal framework of it.
Yeah, great question. Really it's going to depend on how the survey question is written, and I believe it's meant to capture that informal aspect. My collection is generally, I remember it verbatim, but do you work or share information? I don't even think we said specifically share information. That sort of came at a later screen. If I said, yes, I work with Brett, then a later screen will say, well, what do you do with Brett? And one of those options would be share information. So it is only designed to capture any kind of relationship that exists. Relationship may have started at a formal monitoring workshop and then has carried over other aspects, but it shouldn't just refer to those formal interactions.
Okay, so my second question to see if there's other questions first.
Well, I'm going to jump in with the question while we give others a chance to think about that. I was wondering, one of those later slides that you showed about you had communication at one point and collaboration as another, and I'm forgetting what you called it, but you said that organization may be less likely to prioritize collaboration if they had more connections, but they're more likely to prioritize communication. And that just struck me as not being that intuitive. That's the slide.
Yeah, sure.
Explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I can provide the interpretation that you're I've been sort of working kind of with these models just for a couple of weeks, so again, it's pretty preliminary. But what you're saying is correct. That the data suggest and it's not just it's not total degree. What we found was that the total connections weren't a significant predictor here, but it's the out degree. So I report 17 different people. Not that 17 different people report working for me and I work with 17, so I have 34 total connections. It's just I report working with these 17 people. So the more out degree that organizations reported made them more likely to prioritize communication as the primary goal and less likely to prioritize collaboration. And just for clarification, Amy, what I did here was take the survey that was done 4 or 5 months ago, where I asked all steering committee organizations to prioritize that prioritization exercise. Use that as the outcome variable and use these network statistics to see if that would, if any of these network positions would be predictive of selecting certain goals as their priority.
It made a lot of sense to me because the more people you're actively collaborating with, the fewer additional collaborators you're looking for. And just maintaining the collaboration, the communication is going to become more important if you're collaborating with a lot of people already. It's like one would follow the other. You know, if you're starting out, you're not collaborating with one, you're looking for people to collaborate, you're going to emphasize more. And vindicating with everybody you're collaborating is going to slowly shift into the priority as you start having all these collaborators. It just seems like natural progression.
Other questions? I know we have people scattered in lots of different locations on the phone.
This is Lena. We're able to do this webinar, Patrick, and it's great to see results. I am curious in thinking about having, who's in charge of communications for the LCC or multiple LCCs, perhaps a shared position. But, when we think about our communication, not necessarily so much outward-facing to a broader public, but for these networks, a lot of it's more about communicating among partners and then potentially new partners. I'd love to hear just some preliminary thoughts about how someone's job it is to sit and think about how do we be more strategic in that in-reach and those internal communications, how we really use this tool to be more strategic.
It's a really great question, right? Because even your internal communications is really complex, right? It's not just communicating within an individual organization or individual agency or department. I think one insight would be to the hubs. So there are hubs, a network that are identified, and sure that have the message clearly, and the hubs can also then distribute out to other network members. I mean, that's one of the first thoughts that come into my mind is that different steering members have different connections with different other steering committee members, different strengths not all the steering committee members really are connected necessarily. So I'm trying to make sure that it's not just coming from the one central communications person, but it's coming from the communications person that's also then distributing. Also, some of these individual nodes and hubs are also distributing that information. That's one thought. I'd be happy to conversation with you offline and kind of brainstorm and think about this a little bit more in depth too.
Yeah, that's
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Can.
Oh, great. Hey, so I have a question. This is Daniel Escher from DJ Case, and I may have missed it, but what do we know about the level of relationship between people? Meaning, do we have any information about, let's say, a senior level employee having a tie with a lower level employee, or lower to lower, something like that? And I'm asking because one of the concerns that we hear is, that that there's kind of people on the ground, so to speak, interacting with others on the ground, but then senior leadership is siloed, and one senior leader doesn't have nearly the same level of connections with other senior leaders in their organizations. Do you need sense for that?
I think it's a really critical and important question. Different ways and crunch the numbers to give you a solid answer. One thing we do ask is the relationship you're reporting with this organization in general, or is it with a specific person? So in a way we could start to think about those rules. A majority of folks do not sit with a specific person, although there's certainly those instances. And then I guess, really my answer is no. We don't really have a sense of that in this information or this data. But on the nature of this network, in terms of these organizations being steering committees, steering committee members, and usually there's a point of contact, and usually that point of contact is the one that's coming to the meetings, and presumably that point of contact was also the one that filled out the survey. So the survey simply, suggests to let the person fill it out who has the best sense of the knowledge of working relationships within the Northwest Boreal. So I think in cases like this, there's kind of a person that's, in the, say, ELN, the clearly complex organization in Alaska, there's a point person that's responsible for the NWBLCC, or there's multiple point persons. And now whether the leadership or the right people, lower level reporting relationships with other folks, we don't really have that information here. It's when we think about makes collaboration successful and collaboration between or within and across bureaucracies is a critically important question.
Okay, Brett, I guess it's a moment to ask one more question. So you I'm not sure how this we phrase the question, more of a statement, but I guess I was thinking about your research, and I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about the current evolution of LCCs, and you've talked a little bit about the changes in policy and structure. You've talked about changes in leadership, and you were talking about the removal of nodes, and I don't know if you were talking about the changing of sizes of them, or the removal of sort of like meta structure, like you're familiar with the LCC network, which is sort of not as much of a thing as it was, if it's a thing at all now, and obviously the institutional support for the core LCCs has changed. And I guess, I'm not sure what the actual question is, but I was sort of wondering how you view that, or how you take that into account in your research right now.
Yeah, I think it's I use it as an explanatory factor. Right? So, there's really interesting dynamics that were at play when I sent this survey out. I had some forethought, I would have tried to send it out 4 or 5 months previous, but both Amanda was leaving or had left by the time the survey was being out, so she's a really important leadership person in this network for many years or for several years. And it also just had the administration change where this conversations around the future of the LCCs was already happening, a few months or a month after the election. And so, on the one hand, I think me personally wearing my normative hat was disappointed that I didn't see more positive results in terms of network cohesiveness from one year to the other. Some other research I've done, we demonstrated that network cohesiveness or that increase in network cohesiveness. And so part of me was a little disappointed in this work. But I think to your point, without being able to statistically show the effect of the external factors, I think these external factors had a really big influence on the way the respondent bias in the surveys. And so other than knowing that these external factors are really important, exactly know how to show that effect with the work. But I think critical, right? I mean, this larger institutional factors are at play, and they're going to fundamentally shape the structure of these networks that have been formed over the last, 5, 6, 7 years. In some ways, kind of thinking back in this notion of resilience, in some ways these governance networks are going to transform and persist, and in some places they'll probably fall apart. Where that network cycle, I need to show that network cycle there at the end, because we can probably see that. And from my perspective, it's fascinating, a research perspective, to see. So if we were to resample, say here in 6 months or a year, and get a sense of the Northwest Boreal network again after this kind of major transition, we're going to find what network going to look like. Are those relationships going to be maintained? Are those relationships going to be strengthened? In a lot of ways, it's a really neat life experiment that's taking place.
I would just add too that not only is the LCC going through a major transformation, but a lot of the federal agencies are as well, which is probably influencing their ability, or that they collaborate and interact with other groups.
Yeah, the previous question, thinking about leadership, that's very top. Encouragement, sort of the support to go out and collaborate and use resources and time to do so. Yeah.
This is Amy again. Thank you, Patrick. Really great